Donald Trump just demanded Canadian wheat. Not requested, not negotiated, demanded. A sitting American president looked at one of the most stable agricultural trade relationships in the Western world, a relationship built on decades of cross-border farming cooperation, shared grain standards, and mutual market dependence, and told Ottawa to hand over preferential access to Canadian wheat supplies or face consequences so severe that sources inside the Canadian Agriculture Ministry described the private diplomatic communication as unlike anything they had seen in 40 years of bilateral relations. Mark Carney snapped back instantly, not after a cabinet meeting, not after consulting allies. Instantly. And what he said and what he did in the minutes that followed Trump's demand has set off a chain reaction that is now reverberating from the grain elevators of Saskatchewan to the commodity trading floors of Chicago. From the Senate Agriculture Committee to emergency calls between European Union farm ministers and their Canadian counterparts. What is unfolding right now should alarm every American who eats bread, buys groceries, or believes that the United States government means what it says when it signs a trade agreement. This is not a wheat dispute. This is a test of whether economic coercion works against a sovereign nation that has decided at the highest levels of government that the answer is no. When a prime minister responds to a presidential demand in the time it takes most people to pour a glass of water, you know the preparation behind that response was serious, deliberate, and designed to land like a hammer. On the morning of March 11th, 2026, the Trump administration transmitted what diplomatic sources described as a formal bilateral communication. Not a public statement, not a Truth Social post, an actual diplomatic channel communication to the Canadian Embassy in Washington and simultaneously to the Canadian High Commission's trade desk. The communication demanded that Canada provide the United States with guaranteed preferential purchasing rights over Canadian hard red spring wheat at price levels to be determined by American commodity market benchmarks rather than by open international market pricing. The communication gave Ottawa 48 hours to signal acceptance in principle before the administration would, in the words of the document, as described by two sources familiar with its contents, implement structural corrective measures to rebalance the agricultural trade relationship. In plain language, give us your wheat on our terms, or we impose agricultural tariffs so severe that Canadian farm exports to the United States collapse overnight. This isn't just another political controversy. Canada exports approximately $8.5 billion in agricultural products to the United States annually. Wheat alone represents a foundational pillar of the Canadian prairie economy. Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba together produce some of the highest quality milling wheat in the world. Wheat that American bakers, pasta manufacturers, and food processors depend on for consistency and quality that domestic American wheat supplies cannot always match at volume. Agricultural tensions between Washington and Ottawa had been building since late January 2026, fueled by Trump's repeated claims that Canada was manipulating its grain grading system to undercut American wheat producers in export markets. A claim that Agriculture Canada and independent grain economists had publicly and specifically rebutted on multiple occasions. But everything escalated on March 6, 2026, when Trump posted a message to Truth Social at 7:22 in the morning, claiming that Canada was stealing American farmers' markets and that a major announcement on agricultural trade was coming within the week. According to reporting from the Canadian Press and AgriPulse, Canada's Agriculture Trade Monitoring Team in Ottawa registered that post within minutes and immediately began preparing for a formal tariff or market access demand. Sources say that by March 8th, 3 days before the formal diplomatic communication arrived, Canada's response framework for an agricultural demand scenario was already drafted, reviewed by legal counsel, and approved at the deputy minister level. They were not surprised. They were not scrambling. They were waiting. And here's where it really gets serious. When the formal diplomatic demand landed in Ottawa at 9:14 a.m. on March 11th, the response was activated within minutes. Multiple sources describe a sequence that lasted under 8 minutes, from receipt of the communication to Carney's authorization of the public response. Canada's Agriculture Minister had been briefed by 9:18. Carney received a summary call at 9:19. By 9:22, Carney was walking to the podium that had been pre-positioned in the foyer of the Langevin block, with a printed single-page document that sources describe as containing 4 numbered points, each one a discrete economic countermeasure. The press gallery filled in under 2 minutes. Carney arrived at the microphone at 9:23 a.m., 9 minutes after the diplomatic demand landed. He did not raise his voice. He did not look down at the page. Canada received a communication this morning from the United States government demanding preferential access to Canadian wheat supplies at administered price levels. Carney began. Let me be direct about what that communication represents. It is not a trade proposal. It is not a negotiating opening. It is a demand that Canada surrender sovereign control over the pricing and distribution of Canadian agricultural products. Canada's response is as follows, Carney continued. First, we are immediately suspending all agricultural trade facilitation agreements with the United States that operate outside the formal USMCA framework, pending legal review. Second, we are redirecting a portion of Canadian wheat export capacity toward our existing supply agreements with Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom, agreements that we will be expanding in scope and volume effective this week. Third, we are formally requesting emergency consultations under the USMCA agricultural provisions with a 15-day response deadline for the United States. And fourth, we are notifying our partners in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership that Canada may seek additional agricultural market integration in the near term. The room went entirely still. Canada's wheat belongs to Canada. What followed in the 90 minutes after Carney's statement was by any measure extraordinary. Chicago Board of Trade wheat futures spiked 4.3% in the first 30 minutes of trading after the statement, as commodity markets absorbed the implication that Canadian wheat supply redirections could tighten North American grain markets. American food processing companies, including major pasta manufacturers, commercial bakeries, and cereal producers, saw their stock prices move sharply on the news, with analysts flagging potential input cost increases if Canadian hard red spring wheat became less accessible to American buyers. The American Bakers Association issued a statement by 10:30 a.m. describing the situation as deeply concerning for the American food supply chain and calling on the administration to immediately open direct negotiations with Ottawa. In Washington, the Senate Agriculture Committee's ranking members from both parties issued a joint statement from both parties, calling on the White House to clarify its legal authority for the demand and to explain why normal USMCA channels had not been used. That joint statement hit the wire at 10:47 a.m. It was the fastest bipartisan congressional reaction to a Trump trade action that most Hill observers could recall. This is not the first time American agricultural trade policy has collided with the reality that Canada is not a subordinate supplier, but a sovereign competitor with options. Think back to the 2003 softwood lumber dispute, which reached a crisis point when the United States imposed countervailing duties on Canadian lumber. Lumber-dependent American industries immediately identified those duties as self-defeating. The dispute lasted years, went through multiple legal proceedings, and was ultimately resolved through negotiated compromise, not through American demands being accepted. Then there was the 2005 dispute over country of origin labeling requirements that disadvantaged Canadian cattle and hog exports. Canada challenged those requirements through both NAFTA dispute panels and the World Trade Organization simultaneously. The WTO ultimately ruled against the United States in 2012, and the labeling requirements were repealed by Congress in 2015. The lesson was consistent. When Canada deploys formal legal mechanisms through treaty frameworks, it wins. Not always quickly, but it wins. The current situation carries far higher economic stakes than either of those precedents. And this time, Canada is not merely filing a legal challenge and waiting. It is actively redirecting market relationships. David Hughes, professor of agri-food marketing at Imperial College London, told the BBC that Canada's announcement of expanded wheat supply agreements with Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom was not a symbolic gesture. He noted that those three markets represent some of the highest value destinations for Canadian milling wheat, and that even a 10 to 15% reallocation of Canadian export capacity toward those markets would meaningfully reduce the volume available to American buyers, creating genuine upward price pressure in the U.S. domestic food industry within 60 to 90 days. And here's what should alarm every American family that buys groceries. The specific variety of wheat at the center of this dispute, Canadian hard red spring wheat, is not easily substitutable with American domestic wheat for certain high-value food manufacturing applications. Commercial bakers producing high-end artisan bread, pasta manufacturers requiring consistent high-protein flour, and cereal companies with specific grain sourcing contracts have all flagged their dependence on Canadian supply as a quality and consistency issue, not just a price issue. If Canadian wheat supply to American buyers tightens, even modestly, the price signal travels through the food supply chain with a speed and visibility that every American consumer notices at the checkout counter. Bread prices, pasta prices, cereal prices. These are items in the grocery carts of the working families in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, who form the electoral foundation of Donald Trump's political coalition. This puts the administration in a position with no clean exit. On one side, backing down from the demand means publicly admitting that the demand was rejected. For an administration whose political brand is built entirely on projecting dominance, that admission carries costs that extend far beyond agricultural policy. On the other side, following through on the implied tariff threat means triggering tighter wheat supply for American food manufacturers, higher consumer food prices in swing states, Canadian market redirections that strengthen Japan, South Korea, and British agricultural trade relationships at America's expense, and a formal USMCA legal challenge that trade law experts widely assess as likely to go against the United States. There is no version of this that does not involve someone paying a price that was not part of the plan. The only question is who pays it. And right now, the trajectory suggests the answer is American consumers and American farmers in competitive export markets. Let's break down what this actually means across three specific dimensions. First, grocery prices. The timeline from Canadian wheat supply tightening to American grocery price increases is not months away. If Canadian export redirection is perceived by commodity traders as credible and sustained, and Carney's track record of following through on stated measures has made traders take his announcement seriously, wheat futures will remain elevated, flour costs for American food manufacturers will rise, and retail food prices will reflect those increases within 45 to 75 days. Second, American farmer exposure. American wheat farmers, particularly hard red spring wheat farmers in North Dakota, Montana, and Minnesota, compete directly with Canadian producers in third country export markets. If Canada's retaliatory reorientation of its export relationships toward Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom succeeds in strengthening those bilateral supply agreements, Canadian wheat gains a more entrenched position in high-value Asian and European markets at exactly the moment when American farmers were hoping to expand their own export footprint in those markets. The demand that was supposed to help American farmers may, if it triggers the market redirection Canada has now announced, end up hurting American farmers in the export markets they depend on for growth. Third, the CPTPP signal. Carney's reference to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the 11-nation trade bloc from which the United States withdrew in 2017, was not accidental. It was a precise message to Washington that Canada has trade architecture options that do not include the United States, and that continued American economic aggression will accelerate Canada's engagement with those alternatives. Every American business that competes in Pacific markets heard that signal. So did the governments in Tokyo, Seoul, and Canberra. But beyond the grocery prices and the export market dynamics, this is really about something more fundamental. It is about whether the United States can demand that a sovereign trading partner surrender pricing control over its own natural resources, and whether doing so through informal diplomatic pressure rather than through established treaty mechanisms has any legal standing whatsoever. The USMCA contains explicit agricultural provisions precisely because both sides understood that agricultural trade required careful rules-based management. When the executive branch bypasses them with a 48-hour demand delivered through a back channel, it undermines the entire rationale for having treaty frameworks at all. Canada's allies have noticed. The European Union's Agricultural Commissioner issued a statement expressing solidarity with Canada's position and noting that the demand was inconsistent with the rules-based international trading order. Australia's trade minister told reporters that the situation reinforced Australia's view that diversifying trade relationships away from dependency on any single partner was essential economic prudence. The fractures inside the Republican coalition on this issue are widening faster than on any prior Trump trade action. Senate Agriculture Committee members from North Dakota, Montana, Kansas, and Nebraska, all wheat-producing states, all deeply Republican states, are receiving calls from farmer constituents asking pointed questions about what the wheat demand actually accomplishes for American agriculture. Sources on the Hill describe the volume and tone of those constituent calls as among the most intense on any trade issue in recent memory. Trump's public response came at 1:45 p.m. on March 11th. A Truth Social post calling Carney's statement a ridiculous overreaction and claiming that Canada's wheat redirection announcement was a bluff that would collapse within days because Asian buyers prefer American wheat anyway. On that last point, commodity analysts were immediate and specific in their disagreement. Canada has been the world's largest exporter of durum wheat in multiple recent years. Japan has long-standing supply agreements with Canadian grain handlers, specifically because Canadian hard red spring wheat meets Japanese milling specifications that American wheat does not consistently match. The claim that Asian buyers prefer American wheat is not supported by the purchasing data or the assessments of any grain market analyst. This goes far beyond wheat. It is about whether the United States can sustain the economic relationships that American consumers, American businesses, and American farmers depend on when the government's approach to those relationships is demand and threaten rather than negotiate and comply with established treaty frameworks. Every American ally with a trade agreement containing agricultural provisions is now reading the diplomatic communication that Canada received on March 11th and asking a single question: could we be next? If there are no consequences for bypassing USMCA agricultural provisions with unilateral demands, the signal to every trading partner is that American treaty commitments are conditional, reversible, and subject to override by executive action at any moment. That is not trade policy. That is the dissolution of the rules-based trading system that American businesses have depended on to operate in global markets for 7 decades. Here's where things stand right now. Canada has suspended supplementary agricultural trade facilitation agreements with the United States, pending legal review. Canada has announced expanded wheat supply agreements with Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. Canada has formally requested USMCA agricultural emergency consultations with a 15-day response deadline. Canada has signaled expanded engagement with the CPTPP framework. Chicago Board of Trade wheat futures are elevated. American food manufacturers are fielding questions from their boards about input cost exposure. Senate Agriculture Committee members from wheat states are asking questions the White House has not answered. And commodity market analysts are running models on food price scenarios that no one in the administration appears to have run before the demand was transmitted. Keep a close eye on the 15-day USMCA consultation deadline. If the United States does not respond to Canada's formal consultation request within that window, Canada's legal options expand significantly. Keep a close eye on the Japanese and South Korean agricultural import data over the next 30 days. If Canadian wheat export volumes to those markets increase measurably, it will confirm that the redirection Carney announced is not rhetoric, but operational reality. And keep a close eye on the Senate Agriculture Committee, because the members who represent wheat states are not going to stay quiet indefinitely when their farmers are calling. Here's the reality. Donald Trump demanded Canadian wheat on terms that bypass the treaty framework the United States itself negotiated. Mark Carney responded instantly on multiple economic and legal tracks simultaneously with a precision and speed that the administration demonstrably did not anticipate. Wheat futures moved. Food industry stocks moved. The Senate Agriculture Committee issued a bipartisan statement. American allies issued solidarity declarations. And the markets began pricing in food cost scenarios that will reach American grocery stores within 2 months. This is not a story that ends this week. The 15-day consultation deadline, the commodity market adjustments, the congressional pressure from wheat state Republicans, the expansion of Canadian supply agreements with Asian and European partners. All of these dynamics are moving simultaneously, and none of them are moving in a direction that improves the American position. What happens in the next 30 days could determine whether this becomes the agricultural trade crisis that economists have been warning about, or whether someone in the West Wing finds the judgment to engage treaty mechanisms that exist precisely for moments like this one. The evidence is on the record. The demand has been made and rejected. The legal clock is running. The market signals are flashing, and the question of whether accountability to treaty law, to American consumers, and to the farmers who depend on stable export relationships still carries any weight in Washington has never been more urgently in need of an answer. The stakes have never been higher. The food price exposure has never been more concrete, and the consequences of 9 minutes that reoriented Canadian wheat trade have never been more immediate for American families standing in the grocery aisle, wondering why the bread costs more than it did last month.